mongrel intruder. Those stripped of the knowledge to make this helmet shall all watch until the end. Hey guys, so in this video I'm gonna actually show you how to make this helmet. I know I introduced it in a very theatrical way. I couldn't help myself. The helmet is just too cool. So if you want to follow along, please go to my Patreon, then scroll a little bit to download all the files for free. Yes, I sculpted them from scratch, so if you appreciate the freebie, consider supporting me for more. Anyway, so here I'm 3D printing these files using an FDM printer. Very relaxing process, by the way. But once you have everything printed out, you can start cleaning it up. I begin removing the supports. Some come off easily by hand, while others need pliers. It's all about finding the right grip and angle to avoid damaging the print. Some supports peel off cleanly with barely any force. Tree supports can be a real time saver when placed correctly. I use small cutters to clean up the leftover bits and smooth out the surfaces. Making sure you have a clean surface will help you when you're gluing everything together. Now I'm cleaning the snake's head. It's filled with supports, especially inside the mouth. So I take my time and carefully remove each piece to avoid breakage. You do not want to break the teeth or something. Next are the front wings of the helmet. These parts are thin and need a light touch to remove the supports without bending or snapping anything. Last but not least, I clean the top part of the wings with everything trimmed and smoothed out. The helmet is fully prepped and ready for gluing. Okay, so now I'm ready to start gluing the parts. Here I'm using super glue, regular super glue, and I'm gonna use some rubber bands to help me hold the parts together. And let's hope that all the parts are gonna fit nicely and fit my giant head. So I'll check in on you in a few hours. Super glue is ideal for 3D printed parts as it bonds quickly and it holds really well. And as I said previously, to keep the pieces firmly in place, I'm using rubber bands. They help maintain pressure and make sure the parts stay aligned. I apply the glue along the contact edges, pressing each section together for a few seconds before moving on. This part takes a little patience, but it's essential to bring the helmet to life. You'll notice here that I wasn't as careful while removing the supports. The section broke slightly. Luckily, since I'm gluing it together, it won't be visible in the final piece. But just a reminder, take your time doing cleanup to avoid small breaks like this. Here I'm gluing in a strong magnet to hold parts in place later, but I got super glue all over my fingers. Be careful during this step. It took days for the glue to wear off my fingers completely. Once everything's glued and set, the structure should be solid and ready for the next step. So it's the next day, everything's been glued together, and now I'm gonna test if this fits my giant melon. There goes nothing. Okay, that's a good sign. Let me get the snake. I have a mirror right there to help me see this stuff, and feels like it's in there, feels like it's secure. Now this part. I'm not gonna lie, this looks way better than I expected. Here's what's next, is fill in these gaps where I glued the 3D printed parts. And the way I'm gonna do that is using UV resin, and it's gonna look like it's one entire piece. So let's move on to the next part. So here I'm using a paintbrush to apply the resin. The paintbrush keeps it a little bit more organized and easier to apply. Because if you're just gonna dip your fingers in resin and spread it all over the 3D print, I mean, what are you, a caveman? So just use a paintbrush to help you with this process, okay? So while you're doing this, make sure you're in a well-ventilated area where you have an air filtration system like I have here, and the resin cures pretty quickly. So you'll notice that I'm only leaving the light on for a few seconds, and that should be enough to solidify it. While I was doing the snake, I noticed that it's harder to merge those two parts together because of the scales. And last but not least, gluing the snake's neck. And I'm gonna be honest, here I rushed the process a little bit. You can see that I just dabbed the brush and started curing the resin. Not good. It was a little bit lumpy, and please be more patient than I am, okay? But after doing all that, you should have one solid helmet. What's up, guys? Hold on a second. We're gonna start priming. Get your airbrush. For the priming, you're gonna need isopropyl alcohol, airbrush thinner, and a primer. And the recipe is 1 drop of isopropyl alcohol, 1 drop of airbrush thinner for every 5 drops of primer. So fill in that cup with that mixture, set the PSI, air compressor in between 25 to 35. Protect yourself, do this outside or have an air filtration system, and let's get started. I'm starting with a light, even coat of primer. This step does not add texture or change the surface of the print, but it's essential. Without primer, paint just won't stick to your 3D printed parts. The goal here is coverage, not thickness. I keep the airbrush moving to avoid oversaturating one area. If you stay in one spot for too long, you'll risk drips in a bumpy finish, which is not what you want. So make sure to take your time and look at your print from every angle. Once the first coat is down, I let it dry completely. Don't rush this part. Trying to spray the second layer too soon can ruin the finish or cause peeling. So after it's fully dry, I apply a second coat, again, thin and controlled. This ensures full and even coverage, and it gives the paint a strong surface to bond to. And with both coats fully cured, the parts are now matte, clean, and ready for painting. But before that, let's take a closer look at this beauty. So here is the primed helmet. This cool matte black color, which honestly looks incredible. So if you don't even want to paint this thing, I understand you. This looks awesome as is. So let's try to put it on for a second. Gotta take my glasses off. Oop. And this is it. This is what it looks like now. I'm so excited. This is coming out so awesome, but we can't stop now. So let's move on to the next part and start painting. Alright guys, so let me explain what happened here. So I just used the airbrush to paint the first layer of color, and it's a mix of silver, gold, and distilled water. And now I have all my colors, all my paint, all my washes, my wet palette, and my paint brushes. And I'm ready to start painting. Let's get started. I'm gonna be painting this helmet with acrylic paint. And for that, I'm using a wet palette. If you're not familiar with what that is, it's basically a little box that comes with a thin sheet of sponge. You soak that sponge with water, then place a thick sheet of acrylic paper on top. This will keep your paint wet and potentially usable for days, which is great. It reduces waste and you can take your time during this whole process. I'm starting this paint job with the black wash. I put a few drops of it onto my wet palette, then with the sponge, I just start dabbing it all over the helmet. It did a good job at first, but then I switched to using a paintbrush. I felt like I had more control and I could be more precise with the amount of texture I wanted to add. And you'll notice, we're starting to get more contrast already. Now let's work on the front wings. You can see almost immediately that as soon as I start giving it the first layer of wash, the details start to pop. You can see the scratches and the textures that I added while I sculpted the helmet. I find this process very relaxing. So I'm taking my time here while also making sure that the wash flows into the dimples and scratches on the helmet. And I'm gonna start painting the snake now. So I'll need a bit more wash on my palette. And as I'm doing this, I'm making sure that I'm covering the whole surface of the snake's head. What I don't want to do is leave some spots without any wash on them. I've made that mistake before. It's awful to realize that as you're building up the layers of paint, you find this spot that is lighter in color than everything else, and it sticks out like a sore thumb. As I move onto the scales, you can see how much the wash really brings up the details. It kind of exaggerates the shadows and it tricks your brain into thinking that the details are way more three-dimensional than they actually are. I almost forgot the inside of the snake's mouth, and I just spoke about this type of mistake. It's a very eye-catching part of the sculpture, and I was close to messing it up. Here I have the color bronze, black, gold, and gunmetal gray. Now that I've done a basic wash, I'm gonna start layering some thicker layers of paint. I put some of that mixture in my wet palette, and I start applying it onto the back of the helmet. And you can see how nicely the paint flows onto those details on the helmet. That's because I thinned it out with water. In case you notice that your paint is too thick and it dried up a bit, just add a bit more water, like I'm doing here. Mix it with your brush and continue applying it to the helmet. You can move faster in this part of the process and just have some fun moving your brush around. Kind of makes you feel like a kid again. And we're starting to develop a very nice and dark metal color. The helmet looks dirty and old and very cool to look at. And keep layering that paint. Just as a reminder, the paint here should be thinner than the paint straight from the tube, but thicker than a wash. So we get a lot of color, but the paint still flows nicely and it doesn't make the piece look flat. And again, pay attention to the inside of the snake's mouth. Now for the next step, I'm adding a thin layer of black and green wash. I mix them both in a plastic cup like before, and you'll get this dull, dark green color. I place it on my wet palette as usual, but this time, I'm using a smaller brush. I also spread the paint out a little bit on the paper to thin it out further. I'm using the smaller brush to be more precise with where I lay the color. What I'm doing here is adding the green into the valleys of the helmet while keeping the peaks as bright as possible. I also use a paper towel to remove any excess paint. I don't want too much green, just enough to make it look like the metal's been slightly oxidized. That effect is called patina, I guess. It's the same greenish tone that turned the Statue of Liberty from brown to green. You can see that patina effect in the reference photo, and that's exactly what I'm trying to recreate here. I'm using a bigger brush this time, but still avoiding the peaks to preserve that contrast. Up close, you see the effect starting to come through. I'm using this wider brush to both lay down the wash and spread the paint for a nice gradient. You can dab your brush and lift any excess if needed. There are no strict rules here. As long as you've got some cool tones in there, your helmet's gonna look awesome. For the snake, I noticed it's gone way more green than the rest of the helmet. So I'm just having fun and placing the green wherever it feels right. I'm going over the whole snake and removing excess paint from areas where green pulls too much, usually where the body overlaps. I'm done with washes for now and I'm gonna move on to the highlights, using a technique called dry brushing. I'll be using gold, silver, black, and bronze, but mostly silver, just to keep the color light. Without diluting the paint, I place some of it on the wet palette, spread it out, and remove the excess with a paper towel. What I'm left with is a dry brush loaded with just a tiny bit of paint. I start brushing lightly over the highest peaks of the helmet. You'll see that it quickly brings out bright highlights and increases the contrast between the raised and the recessed areas. Keep the pressure light. If you press too hard, it will smudge and ruin the effect. As we go around the helmet, it starts looking not just old, but battle worn. Now I'm using a fine round brush and I load it with paint, but I don't wipe off any excess. I'm hitting the small areas that the bigger brush couldn't reach. Tiny edges that now pop. It really makes you feel like an artist. So enjoy this part of the process. On the front of the wing, we'll do the same thing. Start with the bigger brush, wipe off the excess, and go over the peaks, especially the inner parts of the wing that resembles that of a bat. I'm also dry brushing the forehead area with a very light touch. We're just barely touching the surface here to highlight the different textures. On the right side, do the same thing. Go over the wing's bone structure with a dry brush to pull up the highlights. Now switch back to the smaller brush and punch up those highlights on the helmet and load the brush with your highlight color and gently brush it over the highest points of the wing. You should be familiar with the process now. Just work from big to small. So use the bigger brush, remove excess, and light touch, just hit the highest points. It's not that complicated, it's easy to follow. That's what helps this process stay enjoyable. The risk here is getting a bit careless because the process is so easy, but if you press too hard, you'll wipe away all those beautiful layers that we worked on. For the snake's head, it may not be obvious what to highlight, so focus on areas that naturally draw attention, like the eyes, the mouth, and the neck. Avoid the middle of the body. It's not the focal point, so don't overwork it. And here's a preview of what we've done so far. So let's talk about it. Alright guys, so this is what it looks like right now. And I'm really liking the contrast on everything else on the helmet except for the snake. I think the snake should be the focal point of the helmet and it just lacks some contrast. So that's what we're gonna do next. I'm gonna add more washes to deepen the crevices in the details of the snake and add more highlights. Really clean up the highlights so you can see more detail on the snake. Looking really cool though. Let's continue. I'm going back to the black wash over the snake's body. I'm being loose here, no need for precision, just have fun with it. We've got some strong contrast developing, but I want to push it even further. Now I'm using black paint, not wash, and a fine brush to paint between the scales. This really adds a 3D effect. It takes a little bit of time, but it's fun, totally worth it. There's no strict method here, just go with what looks good. It might look weird for now, but once we layer more paint, it'll all come together. Trust the process. Since the black wash muted some of those highlights, I'm redoing the dry brushing. And for the snake's face, instead of dry brushing, I'm painting the scales individually. It takes a bit more time, but it's a total level up. For the rest of the helmet, I want to repeat the process, but this time more carefully. Now I'm applying the black wash in the deepest crevices. Doing this helps me preserve all those nice highlights that we built earlier. And next, I'm adding rust. It's a mix of black, brown, orange, and red. At first, I'm super careful. This color is bold and saturated. That's why I started on the back of the helmet first, just to get a feel for the color and how it fits with the rest of the palette. Once I'm comfortable, I'm gonna work my way up to the front and paint more freely. The front wings need a lot of that rusty color, so I'm more liberal with it. I leave the highlights alone, but I bring up the color right next to them. I'm not gonna lie, I was getting more comfortable with the process, but I was still nervous painting this part. And I started with the fine brush just to test the vibe before switching to the bigger brush. You'll see here that I thinned the color with water before going in with the full saturation. I picked some areas on the helmet to fill with rust, especially under the highlights. Then I use a paper towel to tap on the edges to create a smooth gradient. And here's a close-up. Paint the rust with the fine brush. It's bold and bright, but then I tap the edges with a paper towel to tone it down and smooth the transition. That's basically the approach I recommend. Layer, tap, and adjust as needed. I'm extra careful painting the forehead because if it looks off, it'll be really distracting. So I go slow here, but I balance that by being looser on the side of the wings. For the snake's eye, I'm just using the same rust color, but with a bit more orange to match the original helmet. You'll notice the paint is thick and undiluted. I want the eyes to have a solid opaque color. On the snake's body, I'm being more selective with the rust, just adding small dots here and there to mimic the look of the original. And don't forget to paint the other snake too. I almost forgot it myself when I was working on mine. Now I'm adding a second coat to get that rich, solid orange just right. Once the paint dried, I could still see some of that dark gold underneath, which isn't the look I'm going for. So I ended up repainting all 4 eyes across both snake heads. Once that's all dry, we'll add the pupils. And for the pupils, I'm using black paint and a fine tipped brush. Since the pupils are sculpted in, you don't have to guess, so just fill in that sharp triangular shape inside the eyes. And last but not least, we're finishing the base, which currently only has 2 coats of primer. And to paint the Elden Ring logo, I'm using the same gold recreated during dry brushing. So just add a bit of that color to your palette, then start building up the color in layers. It took me several coats, so be patient. Make sure each layer is fully dry before applying the next. But once you're done, you should have a clean, vibrant golden logo. And here it is, the final turntable of the Messmer helmet. Honestly, this has been my favorite project so far. The sculpt, the details, the paintwork, but I'm sure you can do better than me. So please, download the files from my Patreon. They're free. Tag me on Instagram or TikTok if you've printed these. And if you found any value in these files or in this video, consider supporting me on Patreon, but most importantly, subscribe. Leave a like and a comment letting me know what you think of this project, and I'll see you on the next one. Ciao.